All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, in today's episode, we are talking about the BOLT score for hikers and mountaineers. And many hikers and mountaineers out there have a natural tendency to look at breathing performance and breathing training. It's a very, very popular thing for hikers and mountaineers, even more so for people who may be going up to high altitude. And if you are into the world of breathing training at all, you've probably heard of this before, the BOLT score, BOLT. A lot of coaches talk about this online. There are dozens of videos and articles talking about this particular score, this particular assessment that people can use. Essentially, it comes from a lot of coaches out there doing a very, very popular certification when it comes down to breathing training, which talks about this a lot. And essentially, these coaches do this certification. They're like, cool, this makes sense. This is interesting. And then they start doing videos and talking about this. And the reason why I'm talking about this today, and the reason why I want to explore this BOLT score a little bit, is there's a lot of information on this out online. But often, and more often than not, the information out there, it isn't presented in a very nuanced way. It isn't presented in a way that is, in my opinion, amazing. And people are very, very bullish about it. They're very, very excited about it. They're like, hey, this is really, really, really good. But they don't really give hikers and mountaineers, I guess, a proper context. So today, I just want to share a little bit of information around this. If you've come across it before, or if you're using it, or maybe it's the first time you've ever heard about it, or whatever it may be, just you're going to have a bit more of a broader view of this particular tool. Now, what we're going to be covering is what the BOLT score is, why people recommend the BOLT score as it relates to breathing training and hiking and mountaineering, and then also how I recommend hikers and mountaineers use the BOLT score if they so choose. So, to start with, what is it? BOLT, B-O-L-T, stands for Body Oxygen Level Test. It's essentially a testing tool used by breathing coaches around the world, and it's used as a screening tool. Some people use it as an assessment tool. Essentially, what it involves is you are holding your breath after an exhalation. So essentially, you're breathing out, holding your breath for basically as long as you can before you start to feel like you need to breathe. That's, in essence, what it is. A little bit more detailed, how you would go about it is essentially you're just sitting around breathing, you take in a nice big breath, and then have a nice big breath out. And then essentially you just hold your nose and hold your breath and start a timer. And essentially you're just holding your breath for as long as you can until you feel the first definite desire to breathe, or the stresses of the body urging you to breathe. So this isn't a max test where you're literally holding on for dear life to try and absolutely get as many seconds as you can, but you're holding your breath after an exhalation until you begin the first signs of hey, the body wants to breathe. And then essentially once you get that first sign, you stop the timer and you get a seconds. Might be 15, 20, 30, 40 seconds, whatever it may be. And the number of seconds you get is the score. So it's very, very simple. Anyone can do it. You can probably do this, while we are listening to this podcast episode if you're interested. And essentially what you do is you take this score and then you apply it to a chart. And the general scoring is, some people a little bit different, but whatever it may be. But typically they say, look, if you're under 10 seconds with this score, they say there's major problems with your breathing. If you score from 10 to 20 seconds, there's some problems with your breathing. If you score 20 to 30 seconds, you're pretty good, but there's still room for improvement. And 40 or more is classified as ideal. And there's a lot more description of people talk about different things there, but that's kind of the general gist. So, all in all, it sounds like a pretty cool assessment. It's simple. Anyone really do it. Doesn't cost you any money. It's very, very clear. You can literally just get a number and pop it towards that table. Very, 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 very simple. So a lot of people really, really, really do recommend this, and a lot of people will use it and talk about it because it's simple. You can literally watch a video and put into action. Now, next up, let's talk about why people specifically recommend this, specifically recommend using this body oxygen level test or this BOLT score or whatever it may be. Realistically, if you've ever explored the world of breathing training, improving your breathing in one way or another, breathing is very, very, very hard to quantify. In the sense, it's very easy for us to subjectively feel like, hey, I'm improving my breathing, this feels more comfortable, whatever it may be. But when we're actually getting objective and we are trying to quantify breathing, it gets a little bit more tricky. There are numerous assessments that a trained healthcare professional can do to assess your breathing. There are a number of different things looking at different factors where you can go to a breathing specialist and they will test you. And this is very, very effective. This is kind of, what we want to do, or what people typically do if they're really diving into this. But obviously, this requires you to go see a healthcare practitioner. This requires you to pay money, book an appointment, go chat with someone, maybe get a referral or whatever it may be. Not super practical for a lot of people. So the idea behind this BOLT score or this BOLT test or whatever it may be, and I know saying BOLT test is, it's not quite right because it's body oxygen level test, but whatever. The idea behind this particular test is it's easy to do. Anyone can do it. Coach can apply it. You can apply it. You don't have to be a medical professional to use. So that all makes sense. So as a whole, finding something simple, pretty practical. But when we get into, I guess, the specific claims around this, as opposed to just using it as a test, and how coaches portray and communicate this test, this is where it kind of gets interesting. Because some people, when they talk about this, they are quite measured in the way they talk about it. They communicate around pretty well, and they are quite measured. And they'll say things like, hey, the BOLT test is a measure of your carbon dioxide tolerance, which is cool. Why would people care about that? Well, if you've never heard about this before, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but in brief, a lot of people who are said to be hypersensitive to carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide in the body, if they're a little bit sensitive to that, that can lead to chronic hyperventilation, so breathing too quickly more of the time, or us getting really breathless in exercise a little bit too early, which can impact our feeling of breathlessness, impact our physical performance, yada, yada, yada. So the idea behind this on the whole subject of carbon dioxide tolerance, if you have better tolerance, you will therefore feel a bit more comfortable with your breathing. And a lot of people say, look, we use this BOLT score to get a measure of our carbon dioxide tolerance. There's a lot that goes into this subject, but this can be an easy metric where people say, you can track and progress in this, and if you're doing certain training, if your BOLT score improves, that's a sign it's improving. Cool, that's pretty measured. However, this is typically not where people leave it at. And a lot of people will take it a bit of a step further. And they're not quite as measured or, as I guess, nuanced or whatever it may be around this thing. And people will often say, and people will quote, and people will say this as absolute fact. They'll say, a low BOLT score means you have dysfunctional breathing. Or an increased BOLT score will help you attain greater physical performance. Or an increased BOLT score will lead to a higher VO2 max and enhanced performance. Or the BOLT test can give you an insight into how your breathing might have a negative impact on your health and your movement and performance. Or a better BOLT score will lead to your breathing becoming more efficient, calmer, and quiet, which will then lead to improved sleep quality, better concentration, improved mental focus, reduced anxiety and stress, better recovery, and lower blood pressure. It gets a bit wild. And those are not me just making them up. They're direct quotes I pulled off people talking about this. A lot of that is a lot to sort of come out of one particular test. And so a lot of weight gets put on this and people are like, oh my gosh, I need to improve this, which is interesting. And then if we want to get into the hiking and mountaineering specific context a little bit more, beyond just talking about physical performance and VO2 max and all of that, I have seen it said from people or person that if you improve your BOLT score, it will help you avoid altitude sickness and lead to pre-acclimatization. No, I'm not making that up. I have seen that. Bit wild. So yeah, let's break this down a little bit because it does need to be said. First and foremost, let's talk about altitude sickness and pre-acclimatization. I'll just get that out of the way. There is zero, and I will say zero evidence to say that if you improve your BOLT score, you will reduce the risk of altitude sickness. There is zero evidence to say that if you improve your BOLT score, it will lead to pre-acclimatization. It's just a wild claim. There's no evidence. It's just bizarre. So if anyone says that, you ever see anyone say that, yeah, maybe you believe it. So I'll get that out of the way. But now let's get into the more regular ones, because that was a bit of an outlier. The first one is this idea of dysfunctional breathing. So dysfunctional breathing it's kind of a catch-all term that covers a bunch of different things that may affect your breathing in a bunch of different categories. It's not like a medical diagnosis of saying you have dysfunctional breathing, but it's kind of saying you may have these factors which is affecting your breathing in one way or another. And essentially where the idea of the BOLT score as it relates to dysfunctional breathing comes from is there was a study which proposed using the BOLT score as a screening test for dysfunctional breathing. So basically, it meant if you went through this, you could potentially use this assessment as a screening tool to say, hey, maybe your breathing isn't quite up to scratch. Now, this particular study, what the idea behind it was, and they were like, look, there are assessments that healthcare practitioners can use to identify these things, but it's not something that the everyday person or the everyday fitness professional could apply. So this study was looking at a bunch of different things and just saying, is there something that we can use and someone that everyday person can apply to see if it may correlate with dysfunctional breathing? And therefore, if it does correlate, then you would go to a medical and get a proper clinical assessments. That's kind of the idea of the studies. And they went through a bunch of stuff, and what they concluded was the BOLT score could potentially be useful in certain contexts. And they said that if people score below 25 on the BOLT score, this could be used as a screening. That was one of the statements, or a part of a statement, I should say. So people have kind of taken this, and they've sort of said, well, if you score below 25, you have dysfunctional breathing. And you see people quote this and say, like, you have dysfunctional breathing if you're not doing this, which sounds scary, which sounds terrible, whatever it may be. But this is wrong, because this is not what the study was saying. There is some nuance to it. The study that people have taken this out of clearly states that using this BOLT score alone, it was not effective if it was used in isolation. It was not something which you could clearly say, if this was low, you have dysfunctional breathing. What they said was if you use this BOLT score plus a particular mini questionnaire that covered a few different questions about your breathing, this could correlate. And I think the mini questionnaire had like 4 specific questions about breathing and how it relates to your life, whatever it may be, which may not sound like much, but this is what they clearly said. It had to be linked with these questions for this to have some correlation. Do you ever hear about this mini questionnaire? No. People just sort of say, use the BOLT score. And the other thing, which they clearly say in this, is the whole idea around this. It's not as something that's supposed to diagnose you. It's not an assessment. It's a screen, which is different, which means that if you did this, you did the BOLT score and you scored below 25 and you did these questions and they flagged up and whatever things, it doesn't mean you have a diagnosis of dysfunctional breathing, but it is a sign that you should maybe go get some further testing by qualified healthcare and get the actual clinical assessments done. Because again, they clearly said in this study that this particular screen was a very sensitive screen, meaning most people who did this failed. So I'll say that again. Most people who use this screen, looking at their potential for dysfunctional breathing, failed. Meaning most people in the population who do this will fail. So to say everyone has dysfunctional breathing or most people will, no, it's a screen. So if you're looking at the whole idea about dysfunctional breathing, there is more nuance to it. It is a sign to say maybe go get looked at. So ultimately, anyone who's just saying this and saying, if you have a low BOLT score, you have dysfunctional breathing, they're not giving you the full picture and they are doing you a disservice. So that's number one. And as you can tell, this does get me a little bit fired up. Next up, let's talk about exercise performance. So people do love to say, if you improve your BOLT score, it will improve your physical performance. They just say this blatantly, clearly, and they say it'll improve your VO2 max and improve your endurance performance and all of this. Logically, there may be a chain of logic you can use to say, if you improve this, this will improve this, this will improve this, and maybe there might be some improvements to performance. But they say it as fact. And when you're actually looking at the research on this, admittedly, there aren't a huge amount of studies that look at it directly. But pretty much all the studies out there that at least I've seen and I've been able to find, none of them support this. One study came out a couple of years ago and they literally said, look, this BOLT score has been used and people say this. So we're actually going to be saying it links up with physical performance. So we're actually going to study that. We're going to look at it because people are saying this. And they looked at elite athletes and BOLT score and kind of like see if there was correlation between their performance and the Bolt score. And they didn't see any correlation. They were like, no, there's not really, doesn't really line up. And that's elite athletes. Another study came out last year and looked at physically active students. And they were like, well, maybe we'll use like a bit more of a normal population. And again, it showed no correlation. So it is really, really, really hard to sort of say that Bolt score is directly linked to exercise performance. And it's really, 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 I guess, misleading to say if you improve your Bolt score, you will improve your performance, because there's not really any evidence to that. So I don't think people who plainly say this, that it'll give you greater physical endurance or give you a high VO2 max or enhance performance, they're just kind of making massive jumps in logic. Yes, admittedly, in some specific circumstances, I could fully understand that it may help some certain people who may have limitations or may have barriers or whatever it may be. But anyone who's using this as a blanket statement is definitely doing you a disservice. Next up is health. Like, I don't want to go into this one too much because it is pretty wild. Instead of saying it'll improve your sleep and your concentration, your mental focus and your anxiety and your stress and your recovery and blood pressure, I don't know if there's any evidence to support any of that. Like, yes, I could see the chain of logic that if you improved your reduced hyperventilation, if you're a chronic hyperventilator and you're a little bit calmer with your breathing, maybe it might just calm you down day to day and help with certain things. But it's really, really wild to sort of say this is directly linked to this. So I'm not going to say too much more on that. There may be a chain of logic in certain situations, again, if someone has a major issue or a genuine issue, but I don't know. The final one that I want to cover, and this is kind of where those chain of logics come from, is that carbon dioxide tolerance. And this is kind of where I think it makes a bit more sense. And I think this is kind of what you would use this as, in the sense that carbon dioxide, when it builds up in the body, kind of drives our desire to breathe and our breathing reflex. And this makes sense to be a bit of a measure. And this makes sense if you're doing carbon dioxide tolerance training and you're trying to improve that, you could use this as a measure to see if things are improving. Not to say, hey, like, you know what, you suck or you're broken or you've got the dysfunctional breathing, but saying, look, this is a starting point. Let's track it and see how we go. And I think this is kind of where it could be used for. And then, as I was talking about those chains of logic, you could potentially say, look, if you improve this and this was a factor for you and this was holding you back, therefore you may be able to perform better here and work better here. There's a sort of chain of logic, but I think you have to be very, very targeted about how you're going to say this. And even then, like looking at this, there was a study that I saw that looked at this as a measure, because there's not that many studies on breathing training, in all honesty, when it comes down to anything. But yeah, it looked at this as a measure for this, and they haven't really been able to, in their particular situation, they couldn't really confirm it as a connection. So there are still question marks there whether this is a super valid test or not. But, considering it's easy, it's cheap, it's simple, it makes sense logically, why not here? So coming down with all that being said, how I believe hikers and mountaineers should use the Bolt score if they're interested in this. First of all, I don't think it's necessary. I don't get my hikers to do it. I don't get my mountaineers to do it. It's not something that's in my immediate assessments or screens or anything like that. I would sort of say, if you are interested in carbon dioxide tolerance, if you've gone down this rabbit hole of breathing training, you're like, hey, that makes sense. That's something I want to improve and I want to track it. Use it as a way to track your improvement. Don't use those scores saying, hey, I scored below 20, I am dysfunctional, or whatever it may be. Take that out of your head, but just use it as a way to track your improvement. And if over time, month by month, you added a bit more, that's probably a sign you're improving with that particular aspect of things. So I think that is a way to use it. If you are thinking about using it as a way to assess the function of your breathing, don't. It is a screen. It has limitations. If you're that interested in that, go book in with a specialist. Go see a physio who specializes in breathing mechanics, or go see a breathing specialist, whatever it may be, and get them to do the assessments on you anyway. Because as a screen, as we said, it's very, very, very highly sensitive. Most people are going to fail that and say, go looked at it anyway. So don't use it as sort of a sole thing saying, I scored low on this, I'm dysfunctional. But if you do it, do the follow-ups that are recommended, that are supposed to be done. And then also, if you're using this to assess your ability to perform, if you're like, hey, if I improve this, I will be better at exercise or better at performing or better at racing, whatever it may be, don't. Do something more relevant. Do an actual exercise assessment. I think that's the most relevant way to look at your assessment. If you're a hiker, do a timed hike, do a climb, do something like that. Do a sub-max VO2 test if you want, whatever. do something that's more relevant. And if you're using it to judge your risk of altitude sickness, stop it. No way. No relevance. Take it out of your thought process there. So with that being said, I think that's all I've got to sort of say on to this subject today. I don't particularly I wouldn't ever consider myself a super specialist in breathing. I don't consider myself a breathing specialist. I'm someone who's learned a lot. I learn a little bit, study a little bit, looked into some things, but I wouldn't consider myself a specialist. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are much smarter than me when it comes down to this stuff. However, when we are looking at this, I just see so many people just saying the same stuff on these types of subjects, and they're saying it as fact, when in fact there is a lot of wiggle room, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of other considerations going in. So hopefully this podcast, this episode can just be a little bit of a counterbalance to that, just so you don't get too wrapped up in some of the claims and just get a little bit more grounded and realistic in regards to this type of stuff. So if any of that didn't make sense, please reach out, let me know. I hope it does, and I hope it helps a few people. And I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you very, very soon. Bye.